Hi, I'm Linda, and this is No Frills ASMR. Recently, I made a video about what different religions like doctrine is about death and afterlife. And through the comments in that, it kind of got me thinking about funeral and mourning traditions around the world, which is a little bit different because these aren't necessarily religious doctrine, but just traditional ways of dealing with mourning and funerals. And I have this booklet that I made the other day for a video I did, which, by the way, interesting video. You should go back and watch it. But I enjoyed the sound of it so much, I thought I might use the other side of it for today's video. I just think this paper sounds kind of crinkly and nice. So I was kind of like thinking about it. It sort of started, I was thinking about Queen Victoria. I always remember the pictures of Queen Victoria, who apparently mourned her husband, Prince Albert, after he died for the rest of her life, I think. And she wore all black, like the big black dress, the mourning clothes. And so I was kind of looking that up, and because it's Queen Victoria, it was the Victorian era. So the Victorian mourning custom, it followed like these very strict rules, and the widows wore black clothing for extended periods of time, sometimes years, sometimes for the rest of their life. And families would, well, first of all, they'd wear black. I mean, the widows would. And believe me, these get more interesting as I go along. So it's just one that I started with. But the families would cover mirrors in the house. And they'd wear mourning jewelry and like other visible signs of grief, like in their jewelry and stuff. And I deal with a lot of vintage things, and sometimes things come up and people say, oh, that's a Victorian mourning, necklace or whatever. So it's kind of interesting. They sometimes would create jewelry from like a lock of hair of a person. And one of the more interesting things, well, let's just put jewelry. So you know what's interesting too? British people and Americans spell that word differently. This is an R, by the way. But yeah, so they would do these things, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this by now, but it was called post-mortem photography. And I always look through old photos trying to look for one. I have not found one personally. I've seen them, but I've never found one at estate sales or anything. Post-mortem photo. And what they do is sometimes hold the person up like with a metal stick, or if it was a child, maybe the parent would hold the child, or if it's a parent, they'd put the baby on the dead person's lap. But they basically would somehow make the dead person sit upright and take photos as a remembrance. And that's just kind of interesting. I mean, part of me is like, well, that sort of makes sense, because if you had photography was not as common, so you'd spend some money to get this done, and it might be your only photo of that person. I don't know. I think that's kind of interesting. So that's Victorian. I skipped like 3 pages. Now, one that I love that makes me think of my mom. I feel like there was some movie in the 80s that showed a New Orleans jazz festival. But it could have been my parents went down to New Orleans and saw one, or we went when we were kids. I don't remember. But they do this thing in New Orleans called a New Orleans Jazz Funeral. And I remember back then, and my mom doesn't, I don't think she remembers this because I brought it up to her and she goes, I don't remember that. But she told me that she wanted to have a jazz funeral and then be like, have her ashes dumped at sea. Now, I mentioned this to her and she's like, what? I don't remember that. So it must have just been a passing fancy. But I've always thought of it and I love it. And I was looking it up, and apparently this comes from like African, Caribbean, European influences, just like a lot of things in New Orleans have sort of French and, all these different influences. That's part of the Creole thing. We should do a whole video on that separately. Actually, there's languages and stuff that are unique to New Orleans. But the funeral, and you can look it up on YouTube. There's some videos of them. But on the they have a procession, not wood, it happens now. But they have a procession and a brass band will lead it. And on the way to the cemetery, they play sort of solemn, like the one that I watched on YouTube, they were playing, oh my gosh, wait, sorry, I'm blanking. Hold on, give me a second. I'm panicked, and so I can't think of it. But anyway, they play like more solemn music. And then it's driving me crazy because it's like, I can't come up with the song name. It'll come to me. And then after the burial, on the way back, the mood changes and the band plays like much more, upbeat music, and the mourners celebrate the life of the deceased. And sometimes they'll have like a second line where they're all dancing and following the musicians, and people just keep kind of joining the parade. I just think that's pretty cool. It seems like a fun way to do it. The other thing in New Orleans, because it does flood there, when you go there, you'll see their graves are oftentimes stacked. They're like these high up stacked. I don't know much about that. I should look that up, but that's kind of interesting too. But yeah, so the New Orleans jazz funeral seems like a pretty cool thing to me. Let me know if you've ever been to one, because I was watching videos. I'm like, that's pretty neat. I think in the last video I talked about, I don't know if I did or not, but there's also, oops, I guess I should write brass band on this. Brass, Amazing Grace. That's the song I was trying to think of. They were playing like Amazing Grace, on the way there, and then more like on the way out. Anyway, Irish wakes. So traditionally, an Irish wake takes place before the funeral in the home of the deceased. And so the family and friends and neighbors, they all gather to pay respects and share stories and eat and drink and support one another. And there's like sadness, but it can also be a lot of laughter and celebration and beer drinking. And I like the idea of that too. Anything where people come together and talk about the life of the person, I feel like that's pretty cool. But historically, it served like a practical purpose because it allowed time to ensure the person had truly died before the burial. Because apparently that was a problem. Anyway, I just saw that somewhere. But it's really about remembrance and kind of coming together and having joy. So basically it's like, I don't know, how do I write this? It's like a time pre-funeral. Pre-funeral time of remembrance. How about that? right, so one that I read about that seemed interesting. It's called a Tibetan sky burial. And this isn't all Tibetans, but some Tibetan Buddhists practice what's known as a sky burial. So after the person dies, the body is taken to a designated mountain area and they offer it to vultures and scavenging birds. And the practice is based on this belief that the body isn't needed after death. So returning it to nature is viewed as like an act of generosity and a reminder of the impermanence of life. So while that might seem kind of weird to like outsiders, like you're giving it to vultures, but it's considered like very respectful and meaningful within their culture. I think that's kind of cool too, you know, like the circle of life situation. It's not even, well, yeah, it is the circle of life. So anyway, that's a mountaintop to vultures. And all of these, by the way, I'm no expert on anything. I just looked it up like you would. So feel free to look it up more. Just sharing for interest, you know. All right, you want to hear kind of a crazier one? Not crazy. I shouldn't call anything crazy because death is, people react to death in ways that other people think. But to me, this seems, you know, more out there. To me, is in Madagascar. And I watched a video about this. It was kind of interesting. Like I said, all these you can look up videos on YouTube and, you know, Madagascar. Okay, hold on. I wrote this word down because I can't spell a word like this by myself. Hold on. And it's Hana. All right, I think this is called Famadihana, which is turning of the bones in Madagascar. And it was an interesting video I watched about it, that families periodically reopen their ancestral tombs, and the remains of their relatives are carefully rewrapped in fresh burial cloth. So the family members, and this is sometimes the only time you'll see like all your extended family, everybody comes together, and and they'll sometimes like dance and have music while they rewrap the remains, and they'll tell stories and have memories and family histories. So the extended family's all sharing memories. And it strengthens the connection between all the different generations and honors the presence of the ancestors. And they interviewed two women, and one woman was like dancing and so excited because it was her grandparents. And it had been 30 years since they passed. And they were taking them out, and she was just so excited to have like that ancestral knowledge coming back out and being shared. But there was another woman who seemed much more, she was happy about it, but also you could tell this was very hard for her because it was her 3-year-old child. And so it had only been 3 years, and they were taking the child out and unwrapping and rewrapping. And I mean, good grief, that would be very difficult. But she did say having all her family together, supporting her and sharing those memories. And you could understand, like for some people, if you lose a loved one, especially, I would say a child, people don't want to bring it up to you because, you know, that's hard, and that can be shocking to the person if they're not ready to talk about that at that moment. But at the same time, sometimes you feel like nobody's bringing it up. And so having a situation where everybody comes together to remember that person, that's pretty special too. Although I don't know about the seeing the body, that must be very difficult. So it's interesting. But the other thing at the end of that little documentary I watched about this, they said that after they do this, oftentimes people die of the plague. And they think it's the corpses have bacteria growing in them. That's the plague when they pull them out. And so now the public health service is trying to step in and say, look, you can't do this. But it's such a long time tradition there. So interesting. I don't know. I don't even know how to write this. Reopen. I don't know. I'm not going to try. Now, I guess this one isn't, a lot of us probably know this one. I know my father-in-law and my uncle both had military funeral. Whoops. And I found it very moving. So they honor the service and sacrifice of members of the armed forces, and you call up the military that your loved one was with, and they send out honor guard, which is usually two younger people in the service, and they bring a flag, a big flag, and drape it over the casket, and they play taps and do ceremonial salutes. And sometimes other stuff, I'm not sure, but that's what they did at the services. And I found it very moving. I could tell you a secret, but it might ruin it a little bit for you. But at both of the services, they're kind of smaller towns, and they send out two guys from whatever the local base is, I think, or maybe just local people who live around. I don't know. But a lot of times they don't know how to play the bugle. And so they put a speaker inside the trumpet and just hit a button and it plays down. And they're just holding it, which is kind of funny once you know it, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I don't care. It's like, oh, that's interesting. And then at the end, they take the flag off the coffin and they fold it in this very specific way and then hand it to like the next of kin, I guess, whoever that might be in the family. And then you can keep that flag. And that's like given to you as gratitude for the deceased person's military service. It's pretty cool. I thought it was really nice. Now, there was a couple members of our family who were like, I thought that went on too long. I'm like, it didn't. I thought it was moving. So I don't know. I guess it just depends. But anyway, that's a U.S. military funeral. And then, of course, there is the Mexican Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. I think I'm saying that right. And that's usually, or I think it's November 1st and 2nd. Is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think so. And so families create altars where they put photographs and candles and favorite foods of the deceased and marigolds. And then people visit cemeteries and they clean up the graves and spend time remembering family members who've died. But it's not really like a sadness day so much, although I'm sure there's some of that. But it's like a remembrance of family connections and celebrating the lives of them. And I think, again, it's like things like this are good for people to get to remember their loved ones like that. I think it's pretty great. So anyway, that's the Mexican Day of the Dead. I have another one that's kind of an interesting one. I saw this. It's actually a YouTube video from a channel called Planet Doc channel, like DOC, like documentary. I'd never heard of it before, but I watched this one. And it was about, let's see if, the Toraho, I think that's how you say it, or Toraho. Anyway, people of Indonesia, and they view death as a gradual transition rather than like an immediate event. This is interesting. Okay, this is Indonesia. And I'm not saying everybody there because I'm sure they have different, but that's what they said on this Planet Doc video. So that's where I'm getting my information. So they said the deceased family member will remain in the home for months or even years, and they what's it called when you like mummify somebody? Embalm the body, and they keep it in the home for months and years, and the family members continue to care for the deceased, and they'll bring them like food, and they speak to them as if they're still part of the household for a long time. And according to this doc, they said part of that's because they are raising money because they have these very elaborate funerals. And oftentimes the funerals will put the family into financial ruin. So they like keep them there while they're raising money and selling off things so they can afford these elaborate funeral ceremonies. And they'll only have it once they've saved enough, so the dead will stay with them in the house until then. And then the dead are carried, and they do like I'm trying to remember. I think they like song and dance. And the one I showed, this I guess you'd call it a coffin. It was like this huge, it almost looked like a boat or something. It was like this. And then like here's the body. And then it like came up, and it was huge. And then there are sticks kind of coming off it. And then all the people are carrying it. And they had like many, many people because it was big and heavy. So there'd be people like this on both sides carrying it. And then they're playing music and everything. And they take them up to a cliffside. And there they have built a tomb that this fits in. And sometimes of all these carved wood, like effigies. And so then they put it, and then there's a party after. And so on this video, they said like the family will be completely wiped out financially after this. I was like, oh my goodness. But anyway, so that is the Toraho. I think that's how you say it, Toraho. Yeah, kind of interesting. I think we already talked a little bit about a Jewish Shiva, but that is usually like a 7-day period following the burial. And I feel like I learned about it from maybe Seinfeld. I hate to say it. Maybe some other movie, I don't know. But during this time, family members remain at home, and friends and relatives and community come and offer support and bring food and share memories and prayers. And they traditionally sit on these low stools, and they cover the mirrors, and it allows you to focus on mourning and grief while having community support. So that's pretty nice too. That's the Jewish Shiva. I don't know. I can't think of anything else. Well, Japan. One thing I was reading, Japan has like the highest cremation in the whole world, I think. So like after the funeral, they cremate the body, and then this is interesting actually. Okay, I don't know how much of Japan does this. I don't know how popular this is, but it was something I read about. Okay, so they cremate the person. And then there is a ritual called, and I might say this wrong, but I think it's katsuesh. You guys can look that up. That's okay. I think that's how you say katsuesh. And so after you cremate someone, there's still going to be bones and things in with the ashes. And I know this from my family. We do cremation, and I've seen this. But they transfer the bones using special chopsticks. And sometimes I'll have like multiple family members, I think, who are transferring the bones. And then the bones are placed in a grave where relatives can visit and pay their respects. And this has influenced Japanese etiquette that you don't pass food directly from person to person's chopsticks, from one person's chopsticks to another, because it resembles funeral ritual. I'm not sure. I was like, what? But they do use special chopsticks for this, so don't worry about it. But I thought that was interesting. And I'm sure cremation in somewhere like Japan, and I could be totally wrong about this, this is just me speculating, has to do with, you know, the amount of people living on a island. If you had full graves everywhere, you know, that would take up a lot of space. I don't know. I feel like cremation in my mind makes a lot of sense, but that's just me. You know, I'm all for it. What else? Anything else? Can't think of any others that I found. So the Victorian, yeah, New Orleans jazz always seems like so fun. Irish wakes, Tibetan sky burial, Famadiana. I think I'm saying that right. Military funerals, Mexican Day of the Dead, Dorao in Indonesia, Jewish Shiva, Japan. I can't think of any other ones I found that I was looking up. You know, it's funny because I am a believer in cremation just because I think wasting money and the embalming process, that to me is all, for me, that's weird, you know, and then to buy a casket, that all feels unnecessary to me personally. It's just my belief. But the only thing with cremation is that I do a family history, and I love looking at old gravestones. And you can find a lot of research from graves and where they're placed and families that are together. It can give you a good idea of who's related to who and what years. And it's been very helpful in family history, genealogy research. And that's the only thing with a lot of cremation. If you don't have a gravestone at all, or if it's just like a little plaque in a church and it doesn't tell you a lot of information, or because of cremation, sometimes families aren't buried together, they're more spread out. It changes that for the family history side of it. That's the only thing about it that I go, I kind of want an old-fashioned gravestone so people can, and it's like, what do I care when I'm dead? I don't care. But I do find it really useful and helpful when I look that stuff up. There's this website called findagrave.com. If you're ever curious, it's really interesting. You can go to a whole cemetery and look up like family names or whatever. We were trying to find a family member, my grandma's brother, I believe it was. She had two brothers, and they both died in the same area. And kind of nobody knew whether the one was brought back to where he was from or left in that area. So I went on a search, and even though he had a grave plaque like in the ground, and it had been completely covered by dirt and grass, but I found in the records that he was buried there and where his plot was, and I could go find it. I just find that's kind of interesting. And sometimes, if you're lucky, those old graves will actually even say how they died or have more information about the person beyond just birth and death. And that can be interesting too. But with women, sometimes it's harder because sometimes they're buried with a new husband instead of with, you know, like stuff like that can get complicated. But anyway, all right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. It's all very interesting. You know, someday somebody will find this book and be like, what the what? On one side she drew kitty cats, and on the other side